Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this week's Inspiring Leadership podcast. I'm delighted to have retired Commodore Peter Scott from the Royal Australian Navy. He was the man in charge of all the Australian submarines, and he had some pretty hairy stories and some really interesting times, and wrote an incredible book, which I've just finished reading. It's in my book reviews on the website, called Running Deep. Running Deep is a great theme because he also now is running ultra marathons. He's just recently come back from doing 100 miles around Mont Blanc. And as I went for my morning run with the dogs this morning, I was just telling him that was a short run. I was just out for a short jog and then a workout in the gym. But I was thinking of Peter as I was doing that. I was also listening to a book called Culture Code, which is well worth listening to, which I recommend. But they were talking about Navy SEAL training. And so there was the theme of the Navy. So it also is very special for me having Peter, because as those who can see on any videos, I've got my father's naval cap behind me. He was Fleet Air Arm in the British Navy, but also my godfather, his best mate, was a submariner in the Royal Navy just after the war. And the stories he told me, and he was in Malta and things like that, of how they lived on these tiny submarines. I mean, yours was small, Peter, but these were tiny. Really made my hair stand on end. Stories of daring do and heroism, but also the fact that as a submariner, you have to be multi-skilled, because you can't go and get someone else from the shipyard when you're under the sea. You go, look, you have to understand about engines. Go and sort that one out. Here's a spanner. Off you go. But without further ado, Peter, welcome. It's lovely to have you on the show.
Thanks, Jonathan. Thanks for the warm introduction, and thanks for the invitation to come and have a conversation with you and your audience.
Yeah, well, it's lovely. We had recently Oscar Trimboli have a listen, and Oscar said a guy I recommend as an inspiring leader is Peter Scott. And Peter's now, you become an executive coach. You're coaching leaders in business, and that seems to be for some of the best coaches I've come across, that combination of having done something else in their careers, business maybe, but a mixture of business and military. I've had an RAF Air Vice Marshal. I've had a naval officer, a helicopter pilot, yourself, who've turned their skills and their love of leading people into their passion for helping other people become better leaders. So tell us a bit about why you got excited about becoming an executive coach like myself.
Yeah, sure, Jonathan. I can pinpoint where that started, actually. In my final years in the Navy, as a senior officer there, I actually took on an executive coach myself. And for 3 or so years, he was tremendously helpful in just helping me think through my challenges, develop solutions, execute, and so I became an absolute fan of the process. And as it came time for me to think about moving on from Navy, one of the things I wanted to do was stay connected. So I've remained in the reserves. And I deliver coaching through the reserves into some senior leaders in Navy and Air Force and Army now. And it just appeared to me to be a great way to do a lot of what I've always loved, which is helping others to, just reach their potential and meet their challenges. But from a different perspective, in a different, not in a command relationship, not as a director or as a direct boss, but much more in a partnering role. And obviously, I was confident that I had the direct lived leadership experience, both being led and leading. But I went to a lot of trouble to then qualifying myself as a coach as well, getting certifications and doing a master's and so on. So just to round all that out and help others in that way.
Yeah, it's lovely. It's lovely. And on YouTube, people will be able to see your room, which is behind you with the pictures. But for those listening on audio, just tell us about there's 3 pictures I can see on the screen behind you that clearly capture some moments in your career. Do you want to just tell us what those are?
Yeah, there's a few there. So one on over my right shoulder is a farewell. In fact, they might all be farewell sort of gifts or mementos from people. That one is from my time as Director General Submarines, so leading the Submarine Arm and my time as head of the profession there. The one in the centre is actually the bridge ensign. So on any warship, of course, we'll fly our national flag on the bow and ensign off the stern. There's not a lot of room for big flagpoles on submarines, so we just carry a little ensign, which we would fly off the bridge or the fin, the top of the submarine there. Mm. And that was one that we flew on a Southeast Asian deployment I conducted with one of my submarines, and it's sort of signed off by the crew. Mm-hmm. There's a little one there which is a farewell from Navy. It kind of lists all my postings through a couple of decades. The one further to the left is actually a chart. There are not many charts which cover all of the Pacific Ocean. So very often they'll cover, the Western Pacific with China and Southeast Asia, or the Eastern Pacific. But that covers the lot, and it traces out a deployment I did with HMAS Collins. So the longest deployment ever conducted by an Australian submarine. Perth, across the Pacific, up to Alaska and back home. 185 days, most of that was dived, and 21,000 nautical miles. So we've actually had the submarines do longer deployments, as in longer time away, but not yet covered that distance. It's a long way in a little diesel boat.
It's a hell of a long way. And that was the thing I found listening to your audiobook. It was one of those things where you couldn't wait to get listen to it again when it was the next dog walk or a run or a session in my gym. And I really enjoyed it. But the thing that struck me was that it's always worrying in the armed forces when you're in a piece of kit made by the cheapest supplier, the bidder who's given the lowest bid, because it might all go wrong. In me, it was Warrior armored fighting vehicles in Bosnia. In you, It was a submarine which was way below the ocean. And when you had floods and fires and problems with batteries and things like that, a lot of the time it was poor manufacturing, whoever made it. It doesn't really matter what it was. And the fact that our governments tend to try and push to the right the next replacement in order to save money. But it has an impact on the servicemen who are in that. What's your own view on that? Yeah,
look, the first thing I'd say at the outset is that most of the submarines I've served in the Australian Navy have actually been first-rate submarines. The Oberons that I served in early on, British designed and built, and they were a highly evolved platform and exceptionally capable for their day. Didn't mean that you didn't have occasional failures and difficult days at sea. The Collins boats remarkably advanced from a technological perspective compared to those O-boats. And we did have some trouble with them, and particularly in the early days when we were just sort of ironing out the bugs and really learning how to operate them, but also optimize the effectiveness of the submarines. And look, Jonathan, you spend enough time at sea in a submarine, you're going to have a day where you get a bit of water in the people tank. I think that more strategic point that you make there about the timeliness or otherwise of government decisions, that can really impact people. And we're in a situation now in Australia where really we've needed a decision on a replacement class of submarines for about the last 20 years. And there have been plenty of decisions made over time. They haven't resulted in new submarines for the Navy. And moving off in a very particular direction now with the determination that we'll acquire nuclear-powered submarines. So a phenomenal evolution. Not before time, in my view. You just have to look at the expanse of the Australian coastline or the vastness of the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, to understand that Australia's always needed nuclear-powered submarines because of the speed and the range advantages that they have. We've just never been had a government that was in a position to set that as the requirement. So happily now we are.
Yeah, and it has been fascinating watching. As a Brit, it's always quite fun watching the French get really pissed off when they thought they had the deal to provide your next submarine, and then in came the Brits and the Americans who went, we'll work with you and you can have one of ours, which of course will all be in the similar thing. And so that really upset the French for a long time. But we won't mention rugby.
I don't I don't have any traditional animosity towards the French at all. And
no.
They would have created a great, they're a great submarine operating nation.
Yeah, they are. And you mentioned them in your book rather. You had a number of good interactions with a number of different navies. But of course, the interesting one is going to be when you come face to face, as you often did. Another submariner I had, who's a good friend of mine, Bob, he found himself one day on the seabed of the North Sea, right next door with his nuclear submarine, right next door to a Russian nuclear submarine, which was tinkering with the cables along the seabed, because the Russians are all working out where to cut all our cables and our connections and internet and everything. So as soon as any kind of thing goes on, and lately their thing is blowing up pipelines, which seems to be their particular forte. But yeah, he found himself on the seabed, and he's pretty certain the Russians didn't know he was right next door to them. But you must have had some pretty hairy moments next to the Chinese submarines, because they've got so many of them. How many have they got, do you reckon?
Yeah, they're in the order of 60 or 70 and across half a dozen different classes. And of course, building at a rate of knots, both, diesel electric boats, nuclear attack boats and ballistic missile boats. Phenomenal industrial effort from the Chinese. And they learn quickly, and their submarines are better and better year on year. So, they're building a formidable force up there.
They are. And in fact, I was reading an article just the other day, where often it's been said that America spends more than any other navy, any other armed force combined. But they think now that the Chinese have been understating what they're spending on defense, as you see some of these huge aircraft carriers. And of course, we don't see their submarines, but their submarines go, the scale at which they are increasing the size of their armed forces. They're a major threat to you. And of course, the Paracel and the Spratly Islands and the Paracel Islands, where they've been building airfields and putting in surface-to-air missile systems and all sorts, in an area which actually the Philippines and the Indonesians are saying that, hey, this is our territory. They go, no, the South China Sea is all ours. We own the whole lot.
Yeah, there are certainly some extensive claims there from the Chinese, and certainly again over the last couple of decades, determined efforts to militarize many of those reefs and atolls.
Yeah. Anyway, we can go off on a whole fascinating tour of Belt and Road and China taking over all the special rare minerals around the world, from Botswana to Jamaica. But anyway, that's another story in itself. I'm fascinated with this whole topic of inspiring leadership, your book, Running Deep, your experiences, and the whole theme of leadership and tips that you have. When we were having that lovely warm-up chat a few weeks ago, I asked you about a couple of inspiring leaders that you would like to appreciate, you'd like to call out, and the qualities that they had. Would you briefly tell me who those two people are that you're going to call out?
Yeah, look, I couldn't go past a bloke by the name of Mike Deeks. Mike and I met first very early on in my naval career. In fact, he was my first ever at-sea CO. In our first year as midshipman at the Naval College, he took us out for a number of weeks on a tiny little vessel, a dozen midshipmen, half a dozen crew, and Mike. In later years, he was my commanding officer in one submarine, Otway, when I was the torpedo officer, another Orion when I was the navigator. And then later he was the force commander when I was in command of my own submarines. So, lots of touch points over the years. He always struck by the boundless humility of the man, just, grounded, centered, connected to himself, but also a wonderful humanity, very empathetic and compassionate, and just able to connect to others. He's a towering bearded fellow, so he might have been, intimidating and imposing, but for that, very humble approach. Sort of bloke who was always, and the mark of a good submariner, always willing to seek and take the advice of others to complement his own competence, and he was very good, and just never afraid to admit a mistake or to admit that someone else was more right. And he was rewarded, year on year with people who were happy and able and willing to put in, the extra yards.
Yeah, and just staying with that one, as you coach business leaders now, as I do, I'm working with a number of different CEOs and their teams around the world, and there's a common theme often where the CEO is the brightest, smartest person on the team. He's a really clever guy, and he could solve all the problems, and often they like to. But it's a bit like Turn the Ship Around, the other submariner, which I love, Captain David Marquet, who I had him on the podcast as well, and Leadership as Language. And in his book, putting masking tape over your mouth so that you don't think you've got all the answers. And this is in business as well as in the Navy as the captain. And what you're saying there with Mike Deeks really resonates for me, and what I really try and encourage the CEOs to do, that they don't have to have all the answers, and they can admit that they don't know and they need some help. And what do you guys think? And to draw on their first team, the team who work to them, just as their first team is the one they report up to. Any thoughts about the business connection from what Mike's done?
Yeah, look, I absolutely agree. It is a talent, though, that people need to, or often need to develop, is that ability to hold their own competence and confidence and ability, and just kind of pull that to the side in order to give those under them or around them the opportunity to lean forward, to think, to take responsibility, to innovate. And it doesn't matter whether you're in a submarine or, leading a tech company, the ability to... there was a moment in time, I was in command of one of my submarines, and it dawned on me, we've got a ship's complement of about 60 odd people. And it dawned on me that at best, on a really good day, I probably had about 2% of the sum intellect and experience and knowledge that was available on board that submarine. And from that moment, I saw it as my job to use that 2% to liberate the other 98% of intellect and energy and curiosity and so on. And I very much see that as one way of describing the role of a
That's
leader
great.
in any enterprise.
Yeah, no, to liberate the other 98%. I love that one. Thank you for that. And what about your other top inspiring leader?
So he is at the top. So that is His Excellency the Governor General of Australia, General David Hurley, who very generously wrote a foreword to my book, which you'll have read, Jonathan. So my most direct connection with him as a leader was I was his chief of staff when I was in the rank of captain, and David Hurley was the vice chief of the Defence Force, and that was an intense year, but an amazing opportunity to be up really close and personal as he navigated those big heavy responsibilities and grappled with the strategic issues of the day. And as we were at war in Iraq, we were at war in Afghanistan, we were fighting for resources at home, But I was, daily just in awe again of his very humble approach to service. It was quite clear to me on occasion that he would very deliberately place his values alongside the big decisions, and use them as a gauge and as his guide.
That's really great.
And not lacking in emotion or passion, but very able as a senior leader to convert those to resolution and action. So just brilliant to watch, and remarkable. I think one of the things I learnt from him was he opened up new dimensions of capacity to accept responsibility, just to take on responsibility and to discharge it. Quite remarkable.
Right. Well, thank you for calling out Mike Deeks and His Excellency, the Governor General of Australia, David Hurley. Now your book and your life. I mean, in a way, your book is about your life and your experiences. As I say, I'm not just saying it because you're here. I think it's a must read for any military man, any businessman or woman, to think about some lessons from that. And also, I was very much respectful of your vulnerability, and that you showed through the difficult times that you went through, what you learned, and some experiences. But if you were to pick out a couple of experiences that have shaped the man you are today, the leader you were in as Director General of Submarines, but at any time commanding submarines, and the kind of leadership coach you are today, to pick out two stories from your life that have shaped you, that might be useful to other people that you've learned from.
Sure. I'm not sure that it's a story per se, but I'd have to start with the family that I grew up within. Had very strong male role models, and I did see the men in my family as my role models. A grandfather who fought in the First World War, came home to be the patriarch of a loving family. An uncle who served in the Air Force in the Second World War in New Guinea, and another uncle who was a priest through his whole life and built a parish around himself, and my dad, who was a career-long public servant. So all people with very strong family values, all service-oriented. And it was no big leap for me to say, all right, well, I might step off. I'm looking for a little adventure. I'm looking to explore the world, but it makes sense that I want to serve in some way. Perhaps the Navy is the place for me.
Yeah, well, I mean, service comes across throughout your book. And all the different commands that you had, the things you learned when you were a staff officer, as you say, for David Hurley, serving in Iraq. That was a Freudian slip. We were just talking about Iran, weren't we, with Hamas. But just all those different experiences that you had, and it sort of how the other thing that struck me was people who are in special forces, or they're constantly on deployments in very stressful situations where there's almost like I think we used to describe it when I was doing operations in Northern Ireland as an acceptable level of violence. I mean, like, what? How can you have an acceptable level? Oh, there's only today there was just about 10 bombings and three murders, 3 shootings. Normal kind of day, and you go, so your level of stress that you took as an acceptable level of stress and danger was far higher than anybody else in a day job, in the kind of businesses I'm in. And I go, guys, let's get this in perspective. Has anybody died today? No. Well, so, but even on your submarines, you wouldn't want anybody to die, but there would be accidents, or there'd be a threat to the ship, or that batteries all start bubbling up, or there'd be gases on the thing, and you'd have to take evasive action or whatever might happen, or a flood, and you had to try and save the submarine. We were describing how cumulatively someone had described it to be like being exposed to radiation. It builds up in the body, doesn't go away, or like being an Aussie, my brother, when he lived out there, slip, slap, slop. He was a cancer surgeon. You cover yourself in cream because, of course, you're so exposed to the gap in the ozone layer, and lots of people get skin cancers, and it's cumulative. And it's the same with the level of stress and anxiety that you had, and there was a cost of that. And you've come to deal with it later in life through psychologists and taking some professional help, but also there's a big culture in the military, particularly in submarines, of drinking, and that had a cost for you. Do you want to talk about both the drink and the pressure that's on you, and how you deal with some of the situations that you've gone through in your life?
Yeah. Look, I reckon a lot of those experiences do accumulate, as you suggest there, Jonathan. And I think typically, and through most of my career, I've managed them reasonably well. You find the downtime, you take the leave, whatever else it might be. But certainly as a youngster, joining that Navy, it's a different Navy today, and joining that submarine arm, there was a very heavy drinking culture, and it was the sort of go-to coping strategy for bonding as a team, for dealing with trauma, for dealing with loneliness or whatever else it might be. And I would say I not only took that up, I was probably a leading advocate of that culture through many years. Now, in part, that was because I was a fun-loving guy who, was happy to push a few limits, and probably undoubtedly pushed them a bit too far at times. There was certainly a moment in time where that came to something of a head. I recall quite vividly a day when I circumvented the Navy health system, went to my wife's doctor, and got a referral to a drug and alcohol clinic, and took myself off there. And I wasn't an inpatient, but I admitted myself to their care, and over several months of treatment and counselling, came to grips with what was by then about a decade of alcohol abuse. And I wouldn't say that that work then fixed me. It didn't even normalise my relationship with alcohol. But what it did do was, set a bar. It was a point in time where I absolutely recognised that alcohol was not my friend, and it probably never would be. And I had to be really specious in how I dealt with it. And I had to find other coping strategies to help me through life, and to, help me develop and perform as an individual and as a leader. Yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing that both in the book and now. It takes a huge amount of courage to talk about these things, and particularly as men, we don't tend to want to talk about things that we're perhaps ashamed about, or we find it awkward to talk about. But there's a surprising number of people. I had many years ago, one of my relations, who's sadly now dead, became alcoholic, linked in the military system, hid away, bottles of wine and things, and just did it for the confidence and giving themselves courage. But it eventually, through other means, killed them. Right. And I've got a number of friends in the military where, come on, be a man, have a drink, they say, with this large beer belly, and you go, I'm not quite sure doesn't kind of fit. And I think for the last this was the last 6 months, I've completely given up alcohol. I don't think I'll go back to it. I occasionally I think we were on holiday in Greece a couple of weeks ago, and I had a glass one evening, and I just thought, I'm not really enjoying drinking this ethanol. You know, I know it's sort of diluted ethanol, but it's not really for me. And I've done it because it was what you did, and you know, you do it to try and fit in and make friends. So it's got to be a personal call, but it's so hard to flow against the tide of a legalized drug that everybody takes. Come on, you know, what's wrong with you? You know, have another one. And so, yeah, let's put that one to bed. But I think it's a difficult one to deal with. I'm always interested in how people cope with some of the darkest moments in their lives and what they learned from it, which we might learn ourselves from those dark moments. Peter, if you were to pick a dark moment, and you had some pretty challenging ones over the years, which would you pick, and what did you learn?
Yeah. Dark moments. So what I know from experience is that, you know, living through difficult times, and that's whether they're sort of shared or individual, really can sap your cognitive and your emotional and your physical reserves. But they do also offer opportunities to, you know, to exercise and to demonstrate resilience. There's a lot of talk about resilience, obviously, both individually and organisationally. I tend to think of resilience in a particular way. I do not think of it as a muscle that you build or something that you accrue and then expend, so much as I think of it as an ability. So for me to be resilient is to be able to do a couple of different things. And the first of those is to recognise the nature of the challenge that you're facing. And, you know, life's complicated, you know, and we're often dealing with lots of different issues at a time. But what's the nature of the real challenge that you're facing? And when you can identify that, then you can go on the hunt for the resource that will support you through that challenge. And that might be an internal resource, you know, a way of coping that you've developed, or it might be, you know, external support or an external resource. And then, of course, the key is to be willing and able to access that resource at the right time, at the time that you need it. So I do very much think of resilience as being that process and that ability to move through those steps and gather around you the resource that will support you through that particular challenge.
That's a good one. And what was, if you were to pick out one of many challenges, what was your darkest moment? And, you know, how did you show your resilience?
Yeah. I don't know about darkest moment. Okay. So the flood features in the book. Mm-hmm. I suffer a few floods over time, but there's a flood we suffer in a submarine in which I'm in command, and we're at deep diving depth, and we have a failure on a flexible hose, and that results in the submarine flooding at the rate of a ton a second.
Wow.
Yeah. So I sometimes describe that as, if you can picture 100 crates of your favourite lager, just sort of build that mental picture for yourself, and then imagine that volume being punched into your submarine through a hole the size of your fist every second. You know, that's going to create some noise and some shock and some damage. So that was a very difficult day. It was at the moment of a flood such as that, everything changes. You go from knowing the state of your submarine in intimate detail to just endless unknowns. And certainly as commanding officer, there's a lot going through your head. Now we got through that combination of, you know, great redundancy in the boat, great training, and great work from the ship's company on the day. As challenging as that was, there were definitely more challenging days to come. At the time, we'd been preparing for a major 4-month deployment up into Southeast Asia to conduct a bunch of classified operations. And of course, that task before us didn't go away just because we'd had a flood. Our job was to pick ourselves up and get off and do that work. Beyond all the sort of technical work, the accident investigations, the design work, the repair work, and so on, we did a lot of work with the medical staff and the psychology staff to work directly with the crew and help them, restore their confidence in their boat and so on. I recall at that time, there were 2 weeks where I lay awake at home all night, every night, holding myself as still and quiet as I could, for fear that I would, I was basically just reliving the terror of that day. But I was trying not to expose my wife to the extent of that trauma, because I knew we had to get back out to sea. And I was fearful that I would not be able to muster the courage I needed to lead my people back to sea. And what I found was that I had to very clearly identify and name what it was that I was most afraid of. And that was quite simple. I was most afraid of dying if I went back out there. And that fear, to be honest, didn't go away. But having sort of put a finger on it, I could see it and I could walk past it. And then I was in a position to, offer courage to my people. And, that comes back to that, the humility and the humanity piece. I didn't just need to muster my own courage. I needed to bring forth compassion so that I could lead my people through their fears and what may have been holding them back.
Yeah.
And we did, 2 weeks after that flood, we took that submarine back to sea, and every member of the ship's company who'd been on board during the flood came back out to sea and took it back out with me.
Well, I mean, congratulations to that. And that whole thing about our fear of dying, it's a trite thing to say that we're all born with a terminal illness, but we are going to die. It's just a question of whether, for me, it's tomorrow, or is it going to be later today, or might I live to 80? And there's that book, 4,000 Weeks, by Oliver Burkeman, where if you're going to live to 80, you have 4,000 weeks. Now I'm almost 62. I've got about 900 left. That ain't long. But then if I'm going to live to 80, and that's another 18 years. And so you certainly realize memento mori, remember you're mortal, remember you will die, was the message that the Roman slaves would whisper into the emperor's ear when he got his triumph, when he could go through Rome with all the prisoners that he'd captured and all the elephants and all these, and they would have a triumph. But the problem was, and he'd wear purple to show that he was an emperor, that kind of, even his face was purple. But the slave's job was to keep saying memento mori, memento mori. Remember, you are mortal. That this too, you shall die as well, and so your day will come. Don't get too full of yourself. My mother was very much into this. Don't get too big. And I'd go, Mother, I've just won the world record for the Cyprus Double Mountain Marathon. And she went, yes, dear, that's very interesting. What did you have for lunch today? And don't get too big for your boots. And it's always that, just stopping. But I
have a wife and daughter, Jonathan, who helped me out there.
Well, that was my next question. People in the services, particularly if they're male, now there's a lot of more female pilots and submariners and all sorts. But in the old days when you and I were serving, for many of the years, it was just men. And they needed really good partners to see them through. Now, give us a call out, if you would, for your wife and your daughter, because there were many a times that you weren't there for them. At a key stage of their lives, you were, as my father was away. Sometimes he was away at sea when I was a young baby. for certainly 6 months to a year without coming back.
Right.
There wasn't things, but you must have quite an exceptional wife and daughter. Tell us a bit about them.
Yeah. And I would say, Jonathan, I'm a little surprised myself to learn or to realise now and again that we've had women serving in Australian submarines for a quarter of a century now.
Wow.
So you're right. For many of the years in my earlier days, I was only ever at sea with men. But the same applies for them. Very often, it's the strength of a partner back home, or at least the strength of family and friends and those connections that not only allows us to go and serve at sea, but also makes it meaningful to do so. So there's this real dichotomy of connection and disconnection, particularly in something like submarine service, where the disconnection can be so absolute and can be extended. There's a story I've told a couple of times about my daughter, and it's in the time really beyond my submarine days. I had been posted to Iraq to serve as the Chief of Staff in the Australian National Headquarters in Baghdad. And this was back in 2006. 2006. So a pretty nasty period of history for Iraq at that time. And I sort of observed in the lead up that my daughter, who was about 12 years old then, was not having any really strong reaction to my upcoming deployment. And I didn't know whether that was because she did not understand where I was going and what was involved, or she understood, but she was hiding from it, or what was going on. So I had a conversation with her, and she came up with something that I found quite remarkable, which was, she said, "Look, Dad, for most of my life, you've been serving at sea in submarines. And when my friends ask me, where's your dad, at the athletics carnival or whatever it might be, the only answer I had was, he's at sea." But and of course, because I was a submariner, she didn't know where I was. She didn't know what I was doing. So that wasn't enough of an answer for her, and it certainly wasn't enough of an answer for her mates. And so she said to me on this day, "Dad, I know you're going to Iraq. I know it's dangerous. Yes, I'll miss you, but at least I will know where you are." And for me, that's going to be easier to deal with than what I've had to deal with for the past decade or more.
Wow.
And it was very telling to me that, for much of that time, I really hadn't understood our relationship and the impact of my service on her. So yeah, they put up with a lot and deal with a lot.
It just affected me a bit, because I know with my father being away, for myself and my two brothers and my mother, she was 33 when he was killed. He was 33 too. That suddenly, him being away, this time he wasn't coming back from sea.
Right.
And he was killed out in Changi in Indonesia when his aircraft had a fault, caught fire, and he got his co-pilot out, but he died in the process of saving his life. And I always kept hoping that he'd come back from sea, and he never did.
No.
And it's easy to minimize things or maximize things. I'm not a victim. I've come to terms with it. I did a wonderful program. You did your work. I did mine. One of the great things for me was the Hoffman Institute program, which is 7 days. I think they do one in Byron Bay in Australia. I'd recommend it thoroughly. Best program I've ever done. I spoke to the managing director of it on this podcast, a lovely lady, and we talked about it. But I think as often with the armed services, you serve your country, in your case, Australia. You give your time, you give your energy, but you can never know the impact on your family, who they are serving too. And there's an impact, and it's the silent impact on them of the moments that you weren't there, and you can't get that back. And I know that in my 20 years service in the army, I made a particular point whenever I could. I was lucky to be home for Christmas, I think, in most years. Don't think I missed a Christmas. That was quite exceptional for the army. You're often away on deployments, but I just happened to, the timing just happened to be right. And to be there at many of the important things at their school. But of course, their mother and I got divorced after 23 years, and that was hard. I'm now happily remarried to Lee, and we have a great life. But it doesn't take away the impact on the family. So I'm really pleased for you that you and your wife stay together and you've got a good relationship with your daughter. But there will be times when you will be at a distant, estranged, as it were, a bit from them both, because when you're away, they have to get on without you.
Yeah, indeed.
But many men, when they come back, think they should take command again of the household. Big mistake, because they've happily been in command without you.
Right.
Why are you just moving them out of the way and say, I have command now? You almost, I don't, no one kind of gets it just right. But what did you do? And how did you manage that transition so you didn't alienate the person who was running the family happily without you?
Right.
And then you come back and you want to show that you're the man of the house.
Yeah. It's a curious dynamic, Jonathan. Hey, look, before I talk to that, thank you for sharing that experience of yours with your father and your experience there, Jonathan. Look, I didn't always get it right. In fact, I very often got it wrong. And I, to a degree, the more senior I got, the more command I had, when I was away in my submarine, that often made it just that little bit harder. I guess I got a bit wiser, but often you would have to, you just have to accept that they have a way of living. My wife and daughter have a phenomenally close connection and relationship because they have shared so much together. And I guess eventually I learned to, slide into that and take my place at home. Could be curious, to have that sensation of, and of course, when you're at sea in a submarine, it is both, a workplace and your home away from home. And, we learn to live, very comfortably within the discomfort. We go to sea in submarines for year on year because we love the life. There's some great adventure. There's a lot of attraction to it. So you can have that very strong sense of homeliness in your submarine away, and then you come home to your home and you can feel a little disenfranchised, and it is quite paradoxical. Yeah.
No, I really relate to that, and even after leaving the military and being remarried with Lee, I had an office apartment in London where I did a lot of coaching, and then I come back up here to my home in Lincolnshire, but I'd be down there for 3 or 4 nights and then up here for a few nights. And it was a bit like being away on deployment. I never kind of felt I was ever settled anywhere. You always had to have a kit bag and ready to go. And I had other stuff down there in the flat and things. But it was only when the pandemic resulted in me not being able to use London, and we went through and eventually sold the flat, and that I was always here or going away for, like I am, to America with clients, or Germany with another CEO and his board to do offsites, that I go away for a period of time and come back. But now this feels like home later in life than I ever expected, probably just after the pandemic when I'm almost 60. So that's an interesting one. Let's there's so much we can talk about, but we haven't got that much time. So I just want to get the essence of some wisdom and advice from you. What we've had already has been fantastic. So let's go sort of quick fire, as it were. Your tips that you'd give people from your experience. Firstly, bit of advice when you started out. If you went back and met Peter Scott, age 16 to 18, or other people have got young people at that age, what matters, what doesn't matter? What would you say?
Yeah, look, I would have to send a message around self-acceptance. You know, as a young person, you may not be the person that you wish to be or the person that you think you can become, but you are who you are. And, you know, being able to accept who you are in any given day, all that you are, respecting that and working with that, you know, can save a hell of a lot of angst. And I think, you know, the corollary to that is, you know, being kind to that person and taking care of yourself. And I've got no doubt that over time, you know, you learn either the easy way or the hard way, that self-care is not selfish. Being selfish, you know, looking after yourself so that you're in a position to lead others and look after them is a responsibility as a leader, not an aside, not an afterthought.
Wow, beautifully put, beautifully put. Let's go around the Inspiring Leadership Compass, which we tend to use, the sort of 8 principles. It gives us some lovely topics to talk of what makes high-performing leaders and teams. The first one is moral quotient, MQ. What tip would you give about what you learned when you let your values, your principles slip, and how you got them back on track?
Yeah. I can follow on a bit of a story regarding the family on that one. Jonathan, there was an occasion when I was serving as head of the submarine warfare training, and it was a year in between at-sea commands. So it was a great opportunity to, you know, be rekindling those relationships and looking after my health and, you know, just getting everything back on track. And we took off. I took the students from the submarine warfare officers course away to take them to sea in one of the boats out of Darwin, so Timor Sea. And they had a week of evaluation up there to become qualified as watch leaders. Great week at sea. They all did fantastically. We piled in. They had something to celebrate. I didn't have anything to celebrate, but I had a thirst. And, you know, a couple of beers in the beer garden in Darwin turned into one hell of an all-night binge. Following morning, so this is another bloody drinking story, but the following morning, turned up late to the airport, intoxicated, refused permission to board. Given that I was trying to fly from Darwin to Perth, it was a day before there was another flight home that I could get. So, you know, my wife, Shauna, was ropeable because I left her in a position where she had to host a bunch of people who she did not know at an event that I had organised for that weekend. So, you know, I'd had an opportunity to, you know, fill the goodwill bucket, and I just kicked it a mile down the road. And, you know, the lesson for me there was, you know, that was just an abysmal failure on my part. And, you know, it was really about knowing what you value and honouring what you value, and, you know, being able to translate what you value into who are the people that you care for, and genuinely honouring those people, which I clearly failed to do on that occasion.
Yeah, well, we've had those moments. I know I've let my values slip, and it's a case of getting it back on, learning from it and not repeating it. Thank you for that. That's one hell of a story. PQ is the next one, meaning and purpose. Gallup's survey, you know, 17% of people find meaning and purpose in what they do, something in the 60% or so neutral, and about 20%, and the numbers don't quite add up in that way, but about 20% are really disengaged massively. And it seems to be around that sense of meaning and purpose.
Yes.
What would you do to, you know, in your coaching or whatever, a quick exercise to help people find their sense of meaning and purpose, why they should do what they do, their big why?
Yeah. So, okay. I love that phrase that talks about us being human beings, not human doings.
Mm.
And, helping people to understand who they want to be as opposed to what they want to do gives you some great clues into, what they do value, where their interests do lie, what gives them satisfaction, and so on. I personally kind of break this down. Every day I set out, really a challenge for myself to do two things, to love and support my family and to lead and serve others.
Mm.
And so, it doesn't matter what the object is on the day. If I find myself doing those things, loving and supporting my family or leading and serving others, then I know that I can find meaning in that.
Fantastic. Now, health quotient is the next one. You're a man who's put huge drive into phenomenal amount of health quotient. But for someone who does, ultra marathons and turning around your bad old days of the drinking habits and keeping that under wraps, what would be a top tip for physical health and mental health? Quick tip for other people listening.
Yeah, I tie the two together, and the thing that as you mentioned, that I fundamentally do there is get out on the trails. What I understand, though, is that I can't run on the trails if I'm not, building the foundations of good health. So every day I'm doing something around yoga or Pilates or some, stretching or mobility exercises or whatever, to keep me sort of, physically going. And, with that in combination with really good sleep habits, and not a bad diet, is what gives me the foundation to then go and perform wherever I need to perform. Yep.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. EQ, emotional and social intelligence. How have you learned to listen well to other people? A key quality in any leader, but certainly in an executive leadership coach.
Yeah. It's spot on there, Jonathan. I think it is an essential skill for a leader. I'm 100% convinced that it is the skill that you need as a coach. You had a guest on, and you mentioned him earlier, Oscar Trimboli. He's got great wisdom around listening. I guess the two bits that I've really taken from him and taken to heart are that first piece about listening to self, understanding and acknowledging what's going on for you. Where are your thoughts? What are your feelings? What's going on in your body, so that you can put that aside to a degree, accept it, put it aside, and really put your attention towards the person with whom you're communicating and trying to listen to. And then that other piece of listening for meaning. I hear what you're saying, but what does that mean for you? That helps immensely. So for me, it's listening to self and listening for meaning are great guidelines in that space.
Right. Love it. Thank you. Resilience. You've talked a lot about resilience. What's a tip to others to pick themselves up in times of adversity, if you were to give a top tip?
Hope.
It's
the value of hope.
Yeah.
And looking for and finding hope even in the smallest of things, and the ability of a glimmer of hope to offer that prospect that things will get better. Yeah. I'll offer you a this sounds a little bit perverse, but one of my favorite trail running mantras is this will get worse before it gets worse. And I just love it, because when you're 50 kilometers or 50 miles into a 100-mile race, and you've run 5 1,000-meter peaks and you've got 5 to go, you've got to be able to accept the reality that, hey, This might get worse before it will get worse. And
Such a
therefore, you may as well be comfortable with your current level of discomfort. Yeah, just accept that and be there. But the other wonderful thing that it does is it tells you that things change. Yes, it might get worse, but yes, it might get better. And in fact, it almost inevitably will. So just, ride it out, be where you are, but live with that glimmer of hope that even if it gets worse, it might then get better.
I love it. I love it. In the last couple of minutes, just your favorite book, and then we'll do your 2-minute top tip. What's your favorite book on leadership you'd recommend people listen to?
Can I run through 4 really quickly?
Okay. Yeah.
In chronological order. So reverse chronological order. John McCain, Faith of My Fathers. Wonderful book about leading and serving with honour. Man's Search for Meaning. Yeah. Well known, Viktor Frankl. Shackleton, plenty written on Shackleton, but Frank Worley's first-hand account is amazing. So Shackleton's boat journey, and this one was on my bedside table. Meditations, Marcus Aurelius.
Love it.
It's that timeless exemplar of self-reflection and insight.
No, great books. And John McCain, I haven't come Faith in My Father. I haven't listened to that one yet. Well, Man's Search for Meaning has been a lifeline for me. Shackleton, I listened to the one on endurance, which was a phenomenal book. So if you've read that one, have a listen to this one. It's quite good. And I'm a great Stoic philosopher. Tried to practice it. And so Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, Seneca, they all matter a lot to me in meditation. Right. So thank you. So, would you introduce yourself, Peter, in this standalone piece, which is also part of this podcast? Just say who you are, what you've done in the past, and then give us your 2-minute top leadership tip, and that will finish us off nicely.
Thanks, Jonathan. I'm Peter Scott. I'm the founder of On Depth Coaching and the author of Running Deep, an Australian submarine life. My top leadership tip is to never add to the fears of your people. Rather, find the ways to give them the courage that they need to face what threatens them. So, I know from some of the experiences we've spoken about, nothing's got the ability to sap your reserves like fear and anxiety, but it's a fact of life. Fear and anxiety are going to impact and affect your people every day to some extent. And it might be fear of success or fear of failure. It might be fear of being responsible or being powerless. Change, uncertainty, mistakes. So for a leader, recognizing the sources and understanding the effects of fear can be really important. Because leadership's got a part to play in countering these and bringing people through, what challenges them. So never add to the fears of your people. Give them the courage to face what threatens them.
Well, absolutely fantastic. Thank you. It's been a real privilege having you on, Peter Scott. I think your book, Running Deep, is, as I said before, very powerful. As is your personal life and your mistakes and your learning and your humility and your humanity and a nice bit of humor. And I think people are very lucky to be coached by you. And I'm sure they'd also value your skills as a speaker to share some of your thoughts, even though you're a very modest, more introverted rather than extroverted kind of leader who doesn't want to be out there, but actually you've got some great wisdom to share. So Peter, once again, thank you for being on the Inspiring Leadership podcast.
Thanks, Jonathan. Wonderful to have a conversation with you.